Why in a society that preaches values such as kindness, justice, and altruism does evil seem so present? This perplexing question has echoed throughout the centuries, challenging philosophers, sociologists, and thinkers from all fields. It is not uncommon to come across news about political corruption, media manipulation, or glaring social inequalities, even in contexts where virtue is widely valued. This intriguing phenomenon is known as the virtue paradox. The more a society emphasizes high, moral principles, the more unethical behavior and oppressive systems seem to emerge. But what explains this seemingly irrational contradiction? To answer this question, we need to delve into the ideas of two giants of Western philosophy, Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche. Both offer profound and often divergent views on human nature, morality, and the mechanisms that allow evil to perpetuate itself. While Schopenhauer sees evil as an inevitable consequence of the blind will that governs human beings, Nietzsche criticizes traditional moral systems, arguing that they often serve the interests of the powerful, perpetuating subtle forms of domination. In this video, we'll explore how these two thinkers explain the paradox of virtue and how their ideas can help us better understand the moral dilemmas of contemporary society. By the end, you'll have the intellectual tools to critically reflect on ethical issues and understand why evil seems to prevail, even when virtue is encouraged. The journey begins with Schopenhauer, whose pessimistic philosophy offers a bleak but deeply revealing view of human nature and the limits of morality. He invites us to question to what extent virtue can truly triumph in a world dominated by selfishness and the relentless pursuit of personal satisfaction. But before we delve into this vision, it is important to understand who Schopenhauer was and how his philosophy shaped the debate about good and evil. If you're curious to learn more, be sure to subscribe to the channel. That way you'll be notified whenever we release new videos like this one, exploring deep and thought-provoking topics that connect philosophy to our everyday lives. Also, turn on the bell to make sure no update goes unnoticed. To understand the paradox of virtue, we must first understand who Arthur Schopenhauer was and how his philosophy shaped the way we view morality and evil in society. Born in 1788 in Germany, Schopenhauer is often remembered as one of the most pessimistic thinkers in the history of Western philosophy. His worldview is marked by a profound and often bleak analysis of the human condition, but it also offers valuable insights into why evil seems to be so prevalent. At the heart of Schopenhauer's philosophy is the concept of blind will. He argues that the world is not governed by reason or morality, as many idealists would like to believe, but by an irrational and relentless force he called will. This will is a fundamental energy that drives all living beings to endlessly seek the fulfillment of their desires. However, this pursuit is always frustrating, for no desire fully realized brings lasting happiness. Once satisfied, one desire gives way to another, creating an endless cycle of suffering. Schopenhauer saw human life as essentially marked by suffering. For him, existence itself is a constant struggle against pain and dissatisfaction, and it is in this context that evil naturally arises. Since all human beings are driven by this blind will, they tend to act selfishly, seeking to satisfy their own interests, often at the expense of others. In other words, evil is not something external or abnormal, but rather an inevitable manifestation of human nature. But what does this mean for virtue? For Schopenhauer, virtue is rare and fragile because it requires the individual to deny his or her own will, something extremely difficult to achieve. While most people live trapped in a cycle of desire and suffering, those who practice virtue are able to transcend their selfish nature through acts of compassion and altruism. However, Schopenhauer recognizes that few are willing to make this sacrifice, which explains why virtue is so scarce and evil so prevalent. A classic example that illustrates this dynamic can be seen in the realm of politics. How often do we see leaders who promise justice and equality, but who, once in power, act selfishly to satisfy their own desires for control and prestige? This behavior is not an exception, but a direct expression of the blind will that Schopenhauer identified as the driving force behind all human actions. Another relevant example is modern consumerism. We live in a society that constantly encourages the accumulation of material goods as a way to achieve happiness. However, Schopenhauer would tell us that this search is futile. No matter how much we acquire, we will never be truly satisfied, as our blind will continue to push us towards new desires. This cycle of unbridled consumption often leads to the exploitation of natural resources, social inequality, and other forms of structural evil. Yet Schopenhauer was not completely pessimistic. He believed that there was a way out of the cycle of suffering and selfishness: art, contemplation, and the practice of asceticism. By denying the will, one can achieve a state of inner peace known as denial of the will. While this solution is radical and not accessible to most people, it reflects Schopenhauer's conviction that virtue can flourish only when selfishness is overcome. Schopenhauer's dark but revealing view helps us understand why evil seems to prevail even in societies that value virtue. However, for a complementary and sometimes contrasting perspective, we need to explore the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche, whose critique of traditional morality offers a new dimension to the debate. Before we dive into that analysis, let's understand who Nietzsche was and how his reflections revolutionized the way we think about ethics and power. If Schopenhauer offers a pessimistic view of human nature and morality, Friedrich Nietzsche brings a radically different but equally provocative perspective. Born in Germany in 1844, Nietzsche is known for his trenchant critique of traditional moral values and his advocacy of a new way of thinking about ethics and power. His philosophy not only questions the foundations of Western morality, but also offers profound insights into how oppressive systems perpetuate themselves under the guise of virtue. At the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy is the idea that traditional morality, especially Christian morality, is a cultural construct that serves the interests of the powerful. He calls this morality slave morality, a set of values based on resentment, submission, and the denial of life. According to Nietzsche, these values were created by the weak and oppressed as a way to control the strong and assert their own dignity. However, in doing so, they perpetuate a worldview that rejects the vitality, creativity, and affirmation of the individual. In contrast to slave morality, Nietzsche advocates the creation of a masterly morality based on self-improvement, courage, and the affirmation of life. For him, true moral value comes not from rules imposed by society or religion, but from a conscious individual choice to live according to one's own principles. This process of value creation is what he calls the transvaluation of all values, a philosophical revolution that seeks to replace old moral systems with new ones that celebrate strength, creativity, and authenticity. But how does this critique of traditional morality help explain the paradox of virtue? Nietzsche argues that many of the systems that promote virtue, such as religions, governments, and social institutions, actually perpetuate subtle forms of control and domination. For example, the idea of being good is often used to keep people submissive and conforming, preventing them from questioning the power structures that oppress them. Thus, evil is not just a matter of evil individuals, but of systems that promote hypocrisy and manipulation. A contemporary example of this dynamic can be seen in the field of politics. How often do we see leaders using moralistic speeches to justify policies that, in practice, benefit only a small elite? This hypocrisy is exactly the type of behavior that Nietzsche criticized. He invites us to look beyond appearances and question who really benefits from the moral values that are imposed on us. Another relevant example is the cancel culture on social media. While often presented as a way to promote justice and accountability, this practice can easily morph into a modern form of slave morality, where resentment and public punishment replace dialogue and understanding. Nietzsche would warn us of the dangers of adopting simplistic moralities that fail to take into account the complexity of the human condition. Despite his incisive criticism, Nietzsche was not interested in promoting chaos or anarchy. On the contrary, he believed that overcoming traditional morality could lead to the creation of more authentic and free individuals, so-called supermen or Übermenschen. These individuals would be able to create their own values and live according to their own will, without submitting to the oppressive systems that shape society. Nietzsche's ideas offer a new lens, through which to understand the paradox of virtue. While Schopenhauer saw evil as an inevitable consequence of human nature, Nietzsche saw evil as a product of distorted moral systems that serve the powerful. But how do these two views compare and complement each other? Before we explore this comparison, I'd like to ask you a favor. If you found this video interesting and insightful, please give it a like to help us reach more people and continue producing content like this. Your support makes all the difference. Now that we've explored Schopenhauer and Nietzsche's philosophies individually, it's time to compare their views on evil in society and how they help explain the paradox of virtue. While both thinkers offer profound insights into morality and human nature, their approaches are often contrasting and sometimes complementary. Understanding these similarities and differences is essential to unraveling why evil seems to prevail even in contexts where virtue is valued. Let's start with the core of Schopenhauer's ideas. For him, evil is an inevitable manifestation of the blind will that governs human beings. This will is an irrational and selfish force that drives all living beings to ceaselessly seek the satisfaction of their desires. As a result, evil is not something external or abnormal, but rather a natural expression of the human condition. Schopenhauer sees virtue as something rare and fragile because it requires the individual to deny his or her own will, a sacrifice that few are willing to make. In his view, evil is inherent in human nature and will therefore always be present, regardless of the moral values that a society promotes. On the other hand, Nietzsche offers a more critical and contextualized perspective on evil. For him, evil is not just a matter of evil individuals, but of distorted moral systems that serve the interests of the powerful. Slave morality, based on resentment and submission, perpetuates forms of control and domination that often masquerade as virtue. Thus, evil arises not so much from human nature itself, but from imposed values that create hypocrisy and oppression. Nietzsche invites us to question who defines what is good and evil, and to recognize that many of these values are cultural constructs that maintain existing power structures. These two views may seem at odds at first glance, but there are important points of convergence. Both philosophers agree that traditional morality is insufficient to combat evil effectively. Schopenhauer argues that virtue is rare because it requires extraordinary effort to deny one's selfish will. Nietzsche, in turn, criticizes traditional morality for being a tool of control that perpetuates resentment and oppression. Ultimately, both philosophers point to the fragility of conventional moral systems and the need to rethink our values. But how do these ideas apply to the paradox of virtue? Schopenhauer helps us understand why evil is so persistent. It is an inevitable consequence of human nature, fueled by blind will. Nietzsche, on the other hand, explains how seemingly virtuous social systems can perpetuate evil by promoting moral values that serve the interests of a few. Together, they offer a broad and multifaceted view of the phenomenon of evil in society. To illustrate this comparison, let us return to the example of political corruption. Schopenhauer would argue that corruption is a natural expression of human selfishness, motivated by the relentless pursuit of power and prestige. Nietzsche, on the other hand, would argue that corruption is the product of a moral system that allows leaders to use virtuous rhetoric to mask their own interests. While Schopenhauer focuses on human nature as the source of the problem, Nietzsche points to the social and cultural structures that perpetuate unethical behavior. Another relevant example is modern consumerism. Schopenhauer would see consumerism as a manifestation of the blind will, where the desire for material goods is never fully satisfied, leading to suffering and exploitation. Nietzsche, in turn, would criticize consumerism as a system that promotes superficial and alienating values, preventing people from living authentically and creatively. Both philosophers, each in their own way, highlight how evil can emerge from different dimensions of human experience. This comparison between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche leads us to an important conclusion. Evil is not just a matter of isolated individuals or systems, but of a complex interaction between human nature, cultural values, and social structures. To address the paradox of virtue, we need to adopt a critical approach that takes into account both the limitations of human nature and the distortions of the moral systems that shape our society. Before we move on to the next part, I'd like to hear your opinion. Which of these two views do you find more convincing in explaining the dominance of evil in society? Do you agree with Schopenhauer that evil is inherent in human nature? Or do you think Nietzsche is right in blaming distorted moral systems? Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your contribution is valuable in enriching this debate and helping other viewers think about the topic. Now that we've explored the philosophies of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and how they explain the paradox of virtue, it's time to apply these ideas to contemporary social issues. After all, the true value of philosophical analysis lies in its ability to help us understand and address the challenges of the modern world. By connecting the reflections of these two thinkers to current issues, we can gain a deeper understanding of why evil persists, even in societies that supposedly value ethical principles. Let us begin with a phenomenon that is widely discussed today: political corruption. In Schopenhauer's view, corruption can be seen as an inevitable manifestation of the blind will that governs human beings. Politicians, like all individuals, are driven by selfish desires, the desire for power, prestige, and wealth. When these desires are left unchecked or unchecked, they naturally lead to the exploitation of public resources for personal gain. Schopenhauer would argue that this is not a failing unique to politicians, but a universal feature of the human condition. In other words, corruption is not a problem of evil individuals, but of an intrinsically selfish human nature. Nietzsche, on the other hand, offers a complementary perspective. He would tell us that political corruption is often the product of moral and institutional systems that allow leaders to use virtuous discourses to mask their own interests. For example, how often do we see politicians promoting values such as justice and equality, while their actions benefit only a small elite? For Nietzsche, this is a clear example of how slave morality perpetuates forms of control and hypocrisy. Evil, in this context, is not just a matter of individuals, but of systems that encourage unethical behavior under the guise of virtue. Another relevant example is media manipulation. Nowadays, we live in an environment where false information and distorted narratives spread rapidly through social networks. Schopenhauer would see this manipulation as a natural consequence of the incessant search for personal satisfaction. People consume information that confirms their prejudices and desires, creating reality bubbles that reinforce distorted views of the world. This cycle of consumption of alienating information contributes to the perpetuation of evil, as it prevents people from developing a critical and authentic view of social problems. Nietzsche would criticize media manipulation as a tool of cultural control. He would argue that dominant narratives in the media often serve the interests of the powerful, shaping the way people think and act. For example, advertising campaigns that promote excessive consumerism can be seen as a modern form of slave morality, where people are led to seek happiness in material goods, thus perpetuating systems of economic exploitation and social inequality. Nietzsche invites us to question who is behind these narratives and whose interests they really serve. A third example is institutional violence, which can be seen in practices such as structural racism, gender discrimination, and the marginalization of minorities. Schopenhauer would see institutional violence as an expression of the blind will that leads dominant groups to seek advantages at the expense of others. For him, this type of oppression would be an inevitable consequence of human nature, fueled by the incessant search for power and status. However, he would also recognize that virtue could emerge when individuals choose to deny their own will and fight against these injustices. Nietzsche, in turn, would see institutional violence as a result of moral systems that legitimize domination. He would argue that many of the norms and values that underpin these practices are cultural constructs that perpetuate resentment and submission. For example, the idea that certain groups are inferior or superior is often used to justify social inequalities. Nietzsche invites us to rethink these values and create new systems that promote authenticity, freedom, and real equality. These examples show how Schopenhauer and Nietzsche's ideas can be applied to understanding contemporary phenomena such as corruption, media manipulation, and institutional violence. Both philosophers highlight different aspects of the problem, but their analyses converge on one crucial point: Evil is not just a matter of evil individuals, but of the systems and values that shape our society. So what can we do to combat evil in today's world? Is virtue enough to meet these challenges? Or do we need to completely rethink our values and institutions? These are fundamental questions that lead us to the next chapter, where we will reflect on the role of virtue in modern society and explore possible ways to promote real change. We have reached a crucial point in our philosophical journey. What is the role of virtue in modern society? After exploring the ideas of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and applying them to contemporary issues, it becomes clear that the paradox of virtue cannot be resolved simply by promoting traditional moral values. We need to go further and reflect critically on how we can act ethically in a complex and often oppressive world. For Schopenhauer, virtue is rare and fragile because it requires an extraordinary effort to deny the blind will that governs human beings. He calls on us to transcend our selfishness through acts of compassion and altruism. However, he recognizes that few are willing to make this sacrifice, which explains why virtue is so scarce and evil so prevalent. For him, the solution lies in practices such as artistic contemplation and asceticism, ways of escaping the cycle of desire and suffering. Nietzsche, on the other hand, challenges us to completely rethink our moral values. He argues that traditional morality, especially Christian morality, often perpetuates forms of control and hypocrisy that serve the interests of the powerful. Rather than adopting imposed values, Nietzsche encourages us to create our own ethical principles based on self-transcendence and life affirmation. This approach requires courage and authenticity, but it also offers the possibility of living more freely and creatively. But how can these reflections help us face the ethical challenges of modern society? The answer lies in finding a balance between the views of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. On the one hand, we need to recognize the limitations of human nature and the difficulty of practicing virtue in a world dominated by selfishness and the incessant search for personal satisfaction. On the other hand, we must question the moral and institutional systems that perpetuate evil under the guise of virtue. A practical example of this balanced approach can be seen in the field of social justice. Movements that fight racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression often face resistance from systems that present themselves as virtuous, but in practice perpetuate inequalities. Schopenhauer would tell us that these systems are the product of the blind will that leads dominant groups to seek advantages at the expense of others. Nietzsche, in turn, would remind us that these systems are sustained by distorted moral values that legitimize domination. To bring about real change, we need to combine the compassion and altruism advocated by Schopenhauer with the radical critique and creation of new values proposed by Nietzsche. This means not only fighting against immediate injustices, but also questioning the cultural and institutional foundations that sustain them. It also means cultivating a critical consciousness that allows us to act ethically without falling into the traps of hypocrisy or resentment. On an individual level, this might mean practicing empathy and open dialogue, while also questioning our own beliefs and values. On a collective level, this might involve creating more just and inclusive systems that promote real equality and opportunities for all. Both approaches require effort and commitment, but they also offer the possibility of transforming our society in positive ways. Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask for your help in continuing to spread these important insights. If you found this video enlightening and relevant, please give it a like to help us reach more people and continue producing content like this. Your support makes all the difference and motivates us to bring you more in-depth analysis on topics that really matter. We have reached the end of our philosophical journey into the paradox of virtue and the dominance of evil in society. Throughout this video, we have explored the profound ideas of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, connecting them to contemporary issues such as political corruption, media manipulation, and institutional violence. Both thinkers offer us valuable tools for understanding why evil persists, even in contexts where virtue is valued, whether through the inevitability of blind will or through criticism of distorted moral systems. But the reflection cannot end here. The real challenge is to apply these ideas to our daily lives. We need to develop a critical awareness that allows us to question imposed values and act in an ethical and authentic way. Whether by fighting social injustices or rethinking our own beliefs, each of us has the power to contribute to a more just and conscious world. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue reflecting on deep topics like this one, subscribe to the channel. This way, you will be notified whenever we release new content that connects philosophy, ethics, and society. Also, activate the bell to ensure that no update goes unnoticed. Together we can continue exploring ideas that inspire real change. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.